You're listening to the Talking Headways podcast network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined once again by transportation and housing expert Yonah Freemark. In part 1 of 2, we talk about the equitable distribution of transportation grants, potential for flex funding for transit, and our annual transit openings discussion. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Happy New Year and thanks infinitely to all the transit planners, bus drivers, advocates, and friends that support the show. To join this merry gang of zoning misfits and transit lovers, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month will get you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month will get you one of our transportation scarves. We appreciate everyone's support over the last year and look forward to sharing more episodes in 2024. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Also, if you want to support the show in other ways, check out the show notes in your podcatcher or go to theoverheadwire.com to find links to our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, our Talking Headways book club shop at bookshop.org, or sign up for a 2-week free trial of our 18-year-old daily newsletter and archive. Thanks for supporting, and this year make sure to listen to this space for opportunities for happy hours, live performances, and updated information on coming attractions. Hope everyone starts 2024 out right, and now let's get back to the show. Yonah Freemark, welcome back once more to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thanks for having me again, Jeff.
I don't know if you're getting bored with me by now, but this is your 12th appearance on the show, starting back, I guess, in 2013 or 2014 or so. So it's been a bit. We've been talking about transit expansion and projects.
The tide has not pulled back, I suppose. If anything, it's accelerated. There are more projects than ever.
Yeah, more projects than ever. I'll ask you about that in a little bit. It's 2024. We just got here. I'm curious about how you're feeling about this year so far.
I'm feeling a bit of trepidation. I think we should be worried about where many transit agencies stand with their funding, and I'm also worried about the election.
Yeah.
So when you put those together, you get a little worried.
I feel like we were just worrying about the election, and now we're worrying about the election again. I have to start thinking about my election day plans. I think maybe we'll do another YouTube show. But yeah, I don't know. I'm cautiously optimistic, but at the same time, I don't really like the idea of having an election this year because it's going to mess everything up, right? It gets in the way of stuff. It takes the air out of the room. It's really a bummer, it feels like sometimes.
I think especially when it feels like we're doing a repeat and somehow the tape has been rewound 4 years ago and we're doing it again. And
yeah.
It's a little frustrating.
Yeah, I think for a lot of folks, but we get what we get. I guess that's how it goes. Not much we can do other than see what happens. Well, I guess, in the last year or two, since we chatted, you've had a lot of research and a lot of stuff come up. So I'm interested to hear more about that. You had a lot of research published and a few reports for the Urban Institute, one of which you put together with a few co-authors focused on equity and infrastructure funding, which I'm excited to talk about. I'm wondering how federal funding is continuing to perpetuate inequality from what you found in the report that you did there.
Yeah, so we spent the last year trying to document where money has been being distributed from federal infrastructure sources. So we were looking both at transportation, but also energy infrastructure, water infrastructure, and things of that sort. And, when we started this project, I think we were already a little concerned that all the money that was going from the federal government into infrastructure wasn't necessarily supporting the administration's equity goals in terms of trying to encourage investment in communities of color, trying to encourage investment in historically underinvested places. And I think the findings that we had from our research were really mixed. So from the positive perspective, we did find that the Department of Transportation is doing a good job with the money that it distributes through competitive grants. So there's some grants like the RAISE program, where the department has choice over how it's going to spend its money. And we actually found that it was doing a good job picking projects in counties that were more likely to have people of color, more likely to have low-income residents. And even when we looked at the specific neighborhoods, we found that that was the case. So that's, in my mind, a good sign about the ability of the government to encourage equity. But we also found some negative things. So one example of that is that we found that communities with higher levels of staff capacity were more likely to get money. Now, this is intuitive, but also problematic. To some degree, it means that local governments that have been able to staff up have been able to get more money out of the federal government, but it also means that we're creating a vicious cycle for the poorest communities out there, because the poorest communities don't have the ability to do things like apply for a federal grant and apply for a federal grant successfully. And so we found that the federal government is not necessarily fixing that problem with its current grant program. So hopefully there's some learnings from that finding. And, we shared those findings with folks in the Department of Transportation and other agencies, and hopefully they are taking those findings to heart to some degree.
Yeah, and I think what we found too is that one of the things I think is really important and is good is that there's outside organizations that are working on trying to build capacity for getting smaller cities and towns and places understaffed grants. But it should be not necessarily the job of the outside groups to be focused on that, right? So we had Robert Blaine from NLC come on the show, and he talked about their building capacity work that they're doing. And basically they found that they had a 40% success rate if you went through this program with the National League of Cities versus like a 5% rate overall, which is amazing, but it also is from that outside group, right? And so you need to have a way to figure out where the places that are missing in the cracks and get them the funding that they might need, whether it's something from an environmental justice standpoint, or whether it's something recently FEMA just announced that they were going to do some distributions based on a mapping program that they have, that they've created, an equity atlas of sorts, so that they can actually distribute the funding so that these communities that are getting walloped by climate change aren't going to get walloped again over and over and over again. So I think those types of things, the private companies on the outside, are not really private companies, but, like groups like the National League of Cities, they're doing a great job and I really appreciate it. But I wish, like you said, that internally it was more of a thing to reach out to some of these places with less capacity.
And I think the bigger problem is that, you can have National League of Cities do a great job with a cohort of several dozen cities, which is wonderful for those several dozen cities.
Right.
But we have literally tens of thousands of local governments throughout the United States. And you have to wonder who's falling through the cracks.
Yeah.
Who really deserves additional help and isn't getting it right now.
Yeah. And I've heard stories of people who say, well, we just don't have the staff capacity to go after that funding, which means that they're not going to have funding for future things. They're not going to be able to stockpile and build on success over time. And that's what you're talking about, the spiral.
Absolutely.
You also had a piece with our friend Linda Rennet talking about the fiscal cliff for transit agencies, and you make a call for flexing federal funding from highways to transit, which we always love that idea. Have you seen any DOTs start to think about that at all?
So what I have seen, especially over the last few months, has been a rising tide of interest from staff members in both the federal government and its state governments getting in touch and asking about this possibility of flexing. I haven't seen this get to the stage of DOTs actually being willing to make that decision to move money into transit. But I think the fact that folks are really intrigued by the possibility and are talking about it is the first step. So I don't know. I guess I'm hopeful, but I'm not banking on it.
Do you think it'll be kind of a bifurcated process where it's political from these state DOTs? The ones that are kind of more in liberal states are the ones that are going to be more likely to flex funding versus the ones that are more conservative states, which have many of their DOT heads fighting back against small changes that DOT wants to make now just because it's coming from the Biden administration?
Historically, we have absolutely seen, Democratic states being more willing to flex their highway dollars for transit than more Republican states. That's just the reality of transit funding in the United States. For example, there was recently a report from the NRDC essentially cataloging the quality of state transportation plans throughout the country from a variety of different perspectives focused on the environment. And what I did recently was actually compare the rankings the NRDC put out with the vote share that Biden had received in 2000. And interestingly, there's a very close correlation between those things. And I don't think the NRDC meant for that to be the case. It wasn't like they were going out to, support Democratic run states or Democratic voting states specifically. But I think the reality is that because of the way people live in the United States, Democrats are more likely to support transit funding and Republicans are more likely to support highway funding.
Yeah. It's just the way that it's sorted itself out, I guess, over time.
Absolutely.
We just replayed an episode with Clayton Nall about his book about highways and politics, and I think that kind of connects to that as well. You also mentioned other mechanisms creating more efficiency through capital spending like bus lanes, rainy day funds. It feels like there's a lot of money out there. We're just not using it the most efficient way to create these things that we need and these ways to make, the systems more efficient, which might actually save us money.
It's really interesting. I'm not sure folks fully realize that there are win-win possibilities with improving the quality of transit service. So we actually have a report coming out very soon, maybe before the podcast airs, related to the potential investments in Washington, D.C. in their bus lanes. And what we did was we measured how much service could be provided if bus lanes were implemented and examined access to opportunity, how access to opportunity would change based on those improvements. And what we found was that bus lanes, if implemented and enforced, can substantially improve access for customers, especially for low-income customers, while also actually reducing operations costs for the transit agency. And so not only can you improve travel times, make buses more quick, speed people through the city, but you can also actually reduce the cost that the transit system is paying for that. And I think that we should be pursuing this everywhere. I mean, transit agencies should be promoting this as a way for them to save money over the long term. But frankly, the rollout of bus lanes in the US has been a lot slower than I think we would have hoped 10 years ago.
It's interesting. We had Tom Brennan on from Nelson Nygaard to talk about this when we were at Impact, but also at the start of the year, there were a flurry of items from Winnipeg. And it's not what I had on my bingo card for the start of January was a bunch of articles from Winnipeg about plans for improving their transit service. But one of the things that they want to do is create these bus lane networks inside of the center city so that when buses are getting into the core where it's more congested, they have more space, and then they can actually use that to have better operations throughout the whole system. And so I feel like there needs to be some sort of coordinated effort to focus on some of these smaller things. And this is actually one of my predictions for later, my crazy prediction for later. We'll talk about it later. But I feel like there needs to be kind of a focus on allowing these agencies to think outside the box from their usual like one project, one win to like multiple little projects to one big win. I feel like there's something to be said there about thinking about the bigger picture of service levels overall, about how they operate through the city. And I think that's something that we don't talk about enough. And we've talked about on the show here, but I feel like outside of here, in our small world that we live in, it's not really discussed as much maybe as it should be. I know that Swiftly and those folks talk about it. I know that the folks at Nelson Nygaard are talking about it. I know that like the agencies and people are thinking about it to a certain extent, but it's not like it's on a policy level, something that we think about from a city perspective, from a state perspective, even at a federal level.
Absolutely. There's been a view among transit agencies focused on things like the minimum operable segment that has translated into the way we do almost everything related to transportation. It's like, well, the project we're going to do is this small thing that maybe will be part of a bigger plan at some point when we think about it. But for the meantime, we're just doing this small project and we just got to get that done. And there's perhaps a lack of holistic thinking in how you bring everything together to have a more effective system overall.
Do you think that's a problem with how we're doing planning from a top-down perspective? I'm thinking about like how money comes from the feds, it gets to the MPO or the state, and then it comes down to the local agency. There are these long-range transportation plans they have to put together, 5-year plans, 30-year plans, and then all of those have like individual projects that have to be on a list, right? It feels like that's kind of part of the problem is that we're thinking about projects individually from that perspective of how we get money versus how we can provide efficient transportation.
It's an interesting question because the whole MPO structure of these short and long-term plans, in theory, is supposed to do the opposite, right? I mean, in theory, it's supposed to create a vision for the future that you are deciding what projects you want to fund based on that, right? You have a view that your goals are to do X or Y, and so then you're going to pick projects that meet that goal. But I think that the reality of the system is that it's actually more like, we're going to cobble together a bunch of projects based on what we can fund, and then we're going to pretend like they're part of a regional plan.
Yeah. It might be something that, the reason why maybe it's not is because it is part of that regional plan, but also because from a street perspective, if you think about like pothole filling, or if you think about like fixing all of your traffic lights or whatever else, that's like usually a city project, and it's not considered, it's just, you have a pot of money that's there for that. But transit agencies don't have necessarily a pot of money for street fixes, right? It's not like something that is usually in their wheelhouse. And so maybe that's a coordination issue. Maybe that's something along those lines, but maybe it is something that is along those lines of what departments of transportation at cities already do. And they should be coordinating in some way. And many of them do, but there's a lot that don't.
Well, the fundamental question is, when your city is conducting a repaving process, is it taking advantage of that repaving process to reallocate street space
Yeah.
in a different way? And is it systematic or is it sort of street by street? And I think the reality is that we have decided for some reason that things like installing a bus lane, installing a bike lane require years of community engagement when it's frankly some paint on the street.
Yeah.
And, I think cities should consider these projects in a different way, perhaps. And it'd be great to see a city just sort of announce that those types of investments don't require that similar level of change. But it probably requires some sort of legal change that is beyond perhaps my pay grade.
There's probably some state laws or something that need to change or something. And here in California, I'm sure there's CEQA stuff that needs to happen. It's crazy. We're oversubscribed on our opposition opportunities. Also, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is maybe outside your wheelhouse a little bit, but the Inflation Reduction Act and the amount of money that's there for clean energy and those types of things. What strikes me is that transit agencies could take advantage of this funding in ways that are not necessarily related to operations, unless it's for like funding electric buses and bus upgrades that way. But, their physical plants and their buildings and all the stuff that transit agencies own, it feels like there's some sort of connection there too, where there's all this money out there. Maybe they could get it for, spending reduction for less just by going and thinking outside the box this way.
You're actually right on my mind. That's what I've been thinking about today. I have been asking folks at the Department of the Treasury to see if they'd be willing to share some data about what governmental agencies have been applying for use of direct pay or elective pay, depending on how you call it,
right,
which is this mechanism where, governments can get tax credits to pay for projects. And I completely agree with you that transit agencies are sitting on a gold mine in many cases because they have these enormous bus depots. In some cases, they have rail depots. Those could turn into, frankly, energy production facilities. Imagine you convert the roof of a bus depot into a solar facility. I think there's a huge opportunity there, and it could be financed with IRA funds. Are any transit agencies doing that? Jeff, have you heard any transit agencies doing that?
Well, so we just talked with Elaine Clegg at Boise, and they're doing a lot of interesting stuff. Obviously, they have electric buses, but she's trying to think of ways to connect those two ends together because there's a lot of funding out there. And so I think transit agencies are thinking about this. I think one thing they should also think about is like when they're done with their batteries on the bottoms of their buses and they don't operate for the bus very well anymore, but they still have a 60% charge or whatever it is, it's still a large amount of power they can collect. They should figure out ways to repurpose those, right? Mm-hmm. Or recycle them or something along those lines. Like you could take all of the batteries out of buses that your electric bus has used up from its useful life in a bus, and you could use it for, basically storing energy for something else.
Yes.
And so there's all these like kind of recycling things that I think agencies can think about, that some are probably thinking about, but the really interesting connections between all of those dots that maybe weren't connected before.
That's a fantastic idea. I mean, imagine if you had solar panels on top of your depot, and then you had sort of old, big batteries that buses use that aren't necessarily useful for a bus anymore, but you're storing up that solar produced energy during the night, and then you could actually use it to power your buses overnight. That'd be amazing.
Yeah. So much stuff you could do. I feel like there's more. And here's the one crazy thing that I've been thinking about too. Like, imagine if we actually funded transit service through like carbon taxes or or cap and trade or whatever it is. The transit agencies should have a beeline to basically access those funds because they're actually reducing emissions. When they are reducing emissions, I know that there's some bus lines that are only carrying a couple passengers, but if you're getting over 7 packs per bus on a corridor per mile or whatever it is, you're reducing emissions. And so you should be able to access funds from those created mechanisms. Now, whether we can create those mechanisms or not, some states have them, some states don't. I feel like there's all this money out there somewhere that can be used for building up operations in cities. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit. What about housing research? Tell me a little bit about what you're thinking about on housing.
Yeah, so we've been continuing to expand our sort of portfolio on land use research at Urban Institute. I think it's of interest to a lot of policymakers throughout the country to understand what land use changes are potentially most valuable, most effective in terms of generating additional housing, reducing housing costs. And one of the things we've been working on over the past year has been building on some research that we have been doing in Seattle region, the Puget Sound. We know, based on some research we finished in January of 2023, that there's this opportunity to completely rezone the Puget Sound and accommodate hundreds of thousands of new residents and potentially significantly reduce housing costs in that area. But we also know from a series of different research studies that we've done that even additional new housing brought on through the market through zoning change is unlikely to be adequate to support the needs of people with very low incomes. It's just reality. We can do all that we can to encourage private investment in new housing, and there will be some filtering of that housing so that wealthier people go into the new housing and frankly, lower income people go into the older housing. But we know also that that will still not be enough to ensure that people at the very low range of incomes are able to actually afford housing. So what we're trying to encourage in the Seattle region and in other parts of the country is thinking systematically of land use change and investment in affordable housing as linked to one another, especially in association with transit. I think as folks at the Center for Neighborhood Technology have told us for many decades at this point, we have to think about housing and transportation costs as linked to one another. So, even if somebody's housing costs are somewhat higher, if they're able to save money on transportation, getting them in a place near transit can really be valuable. If you combine that thinking with investments in affordable housing in those places near transit, you can really do a lot to improve quality of life and reduce household expenditures for the people who are able to live there. So my hope is that we can continue pushing this message of changes to zoning to allow denser housing by market rate actors, while also investment in publicly supported housing. And that can be done in a number of ways. I think folks all around the country are considering a number of different ideas, whether that's increased tax credits or social housing in some places.
Did you see that Newsweek item a couple of weeks ago talking about how smaller cities are actually more expensive than maybe larger cities because people have opportunities to figure out how to reduce their costs, whether that's living with roommates in bigger cities or finding like farmers markets or whatever it is, but their housing plus transportation costs are inching lower in a place like New York City versus other, car-oriented cities around the country where transportation costs are expanding. I found that really interesting that showed up in a national publication from a journalist that I'd never heard of. And so they're talking about these things. And I talked about this with Beth Osborne recently too, but I think it's really interesting to see these ideas that you're talking about pop up, after CNT have done them so many years ago, but they are kind of trickling into the consciousness of the discussion.
The normies are starting to understand the connection between housing and transportation.
Oh, normies. Well, let's chat about something that the non-normies really care about, which is your expansion post that happens every year. And all the folks that are listening to this show are really excited about it because I got so many emails and messages asking me, when is Yonah coming on to talk about this? And I always have fun with that because I think it's so exciting that so many people are excited about what we're excited about. But you're entering your 16th year of putting together project lists. I'm wondering also, let's take a little kind of memory lane push back. And I'm wondering what's changed since 2009.
Well, since 2009, I think the first thing that has changed is the availability of information that we can collect from around the world to understand what's happening in terms of investment in transportation, for example, has just radically changed. I mean, it just was not possible in 2009 to have any idea of what was happening in countries like China or India or Southeast Asia, countries in Southeast Asia. There are a number of reasons for that. One is literally there were no websites. The news organizations there were not online, but also translation was terrible during that period. Mm-hmm. And so from an American's perspective, who wants to understand something about Asia, for example, the idea of doing so in 2009 was like entering into a rabbit's warren of reading remember there used to be all those forums that you would read and try to get track of what was going on. So that's been really wonderful from my perspective. I'm sure there are many Wikipedia addicts out there who can't help themselves just learning more and more. And I think it's just wonderful to see how it's one of the great things I think in our lifetime, right? Just to see how much more easy it is to acquire information. So that's
Now, for you, though, is that a blessing or a curse?
so for me,
Having
it's
to collect all this information, because I've seen how you've gone from US projects to now like the list. I mean, I can't lie. I was looking down the list and I kind of glossed over. I was like, this is a lot of
oh yeah.
information. I can't take this in the next week or so to figure out what we need to talk about, but it's a lot and you're collecting all this and I'm just amazed.
A few things. Certainly I probably waste too much time on a project that is not funded, and I simply use it as a bit of a hobby. I would say that I started out this project in the United States exclusively, and have systematically tried to expand over time until tried to cover systems all around the world, which has been wonderful. I do think that one thing that has been great about, the Transport Politic in general and Transit Explorer as a website, part of that is that folks contribute to it by just emailing me or filling out the form online and telling me what's wrong or telling me about changes. For the most part, I have no idea who these people are. But the fact that people are excited enough to want to keep track of change, to want to submit new information, in some cases to provide geographic information to add to the website, I think it really speaks to the fact that people are aware of public transportation investment as a worldwide phenomenon and something that's worth considering from a worldwide perspective. And I think one thing that's particularly good about it from the US perspective is that it enables us to put the experience that you and I have, frankly, on a day-to-day basis into perspective. Is the quality and the condition of the transit system that we see on a day-to-day basis acceptable? And I think by documenting what's occurring everywhere else, you can at least put the US within a global framework. And I think people appreciate that.
Yeah. And you know what? I get joy out of seeing when you post something, when you post the article for the 2024 projects list and you get all these submissions underneath, it feels like going back to like original Twitter, right? Where basically people aren't adversarial. They're like, oh, hey, there's this project here and there's this project here. And I really like, it gave me joy because it reminded me of the fun times that we had trying to pull all these things together in Web 1.0 or whatever it was when we were blogging about this stuff. And people, coming on to your comment section, not to like, give you a hard time, but being like, oh yeah, I agree with that. But also there's this other stuff going on and sharing information and kind of making it a community. So I really appreciate that. That makes me happy. What doesn't make me happy, though, is that we can see what's going on in other countries and we can get really depressed by it, right? So like looking at the China list, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. Like so much is happening. They're doing so many expansion projects of subways and we are just getting left behind in terms of, the comparison of we can maybe build a couple of miles of the Second Avenue subway and they can build 200 miles of subway network in the country. And I think that has brought kind of some clarity about how far behind we are, not just to China, but France and places around the globe that are just going faster and doing more.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. The world is filled with many different people and many different political systems, some of which are not at all acceptable from a civil rights perspective. It's difficult to, I think that when we are conducting an international comparison of things like public investment, and you see all the investment in places like China, Turkey, Iran, to name a few countries that have problematic records when it comes to democracy and rights, I think it should raise alarm bells to make too close of a comparison with the United States. But at the same time, we can also look at other countries where the democratic record is a lot stronger right now. Chile, much of Europe, they have much stronger democracies equivalent to those in the United States, where there also is more transit investment happening. So it's interesting because, from my perspective, it is true that China and India increasingly are investing massively in metro systems, and those are really remarkable to watch. But from my perspective, it's most interesting to compare the United States with those other democratic countries because ultimately, hopefully we can retain our system of rights and democracy.
Crossing my fingers, 2024 election.
Yeah.
Well, there were some big openings this last year for projects here in the United States that we can celebrate. The Regional Connector, East Side Access, Honolulu finally opened. We've been talking about that for years. That seemed to be a running joke on the show that we
Yes.
had. So they opened that one too. How are you feeling about this last year's openings?
I think I was most excited about the new projects in Honolulu for the reason that you described, which is that literally we've been waiting for this for 10 years. So, finally something is happening there. And it's also nice to see the implementation of world-class automated metro being implemented in the United States. This is the type of investment that we should be seeing in a lot more cities and that you do see in other parts of the world, even in North America, in Montreal and Vancouver at this point. So I'm hopeful that folks get out to see Honolulu's project and that project continues to be implemented successfully in the coming years.
Yeah, I hope it gets expanded to where it was originally meant to go, because that would be really beneficial for them to have access to all the destinations. That will drive ridership, right? And so building half a line isn't really the end game there. It should be building the whole line, but it's expensive for them. They keep on having to add money and it's complicated.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about Honolulu is that it's not a very big city. Compared to other US cities investing in major transit expansions, it's one of the smallest, perhaps smaller than anything except for Salt Lake City. And that puts a lot of strain, I think, on the local finances of the project to build this elevated line. But I still think that it's one of the best corridors in the country when it comes to actually moving people around. It takes advantage of the fact that most population is really densely settled on this small area of land between the beach and the mountains. So, there's a huge opportunity there if they can continue getting it right.
Yeah, it has we used to talk about weighted densities a lot, but it has one of the highest weighted densities of all United States cities. And so it's not like they're lacking the geography for it. It's definitely a place where they should be putting it. So I hope to see it succeed. Then I'd like to see them be copied other places.
Absolutely.
Openings this year are quite stark, though, right? So I think I'm a little bit more excited about Transit Christmas coming out. The New Starts / CIG or whatever we're going to call it these days list. Whenever that comes out in the next few months, hopefully, I'm looking forward to seeing what's on that list and if it's expanded or not. But this year, it looks a little bit like there's a dearth of of things opening.
Yeah, it's not clear to me why there was a slowdown in projects other than perhaps the fact that the cost of projects has continued to accelerate, as we know. And every time projects become more expensive, you have less resources to build more projects, just honestly. And, it's been really great to see in Seattle, for example, the expansion of the transit lines, which I think is actually the biggest openings in the United States planned for 2024. But you're right that in most other parts of the country that 10 years ago, we're opening new light rail lines in places like Portland, Salt Lake again, seem to sort of fallen off the map. These cities are no longer actively pursuing major light rail expansions. Maybe Portland will get a line over into Vancouver, Washington with the new bridge, but the pace seems to have slowed down a little bit.
Yeah. Salt Lake, I mean, they're the point redevelopment of that prison over by, I think it's Draper, down on the south side of the city. They're looking at $950 million investment there. There's some other stuff that's probably out there. It's just it's not as out front as it used to be. I mean, I remember when Salt Lake, it was very inventive because they were like, we'll build 5 lines and we'll get 20% of that from the feds and we'll package them as a deal and then we'll build them and then we'll be able to do more. And now I haven't seen really that kind of stuff, although we'll talk about something in a second. But I feel like there's not that bundling thing that was going on back in the day where you had a bunch of projects going on in these smaller places and the expansion that we saw. And I think partly to your point about it getting more expensive, I mean, we're seeing what's going on with the Southwest Corridor in Minneapolis. There's fights over that. There's even fights. I think that's part of the fight even of over, reorganizing the Met Council was some of this stuff that's going on because of how much projects cost is starting to make people rethink governance, which is pretty crazy to me thinking about that. I mean, just 5 years ago, I don't think that discussion maybe would have happened. So that's interesting too. Houston's University Avenue BRT, Second Avenue subway extension. I'm thinking about these projects in the U.S. context that are exciting to me anyways. But when you looked at all those lists of projects from other countries, I'm curious if there were any that stood out to you or that were you saw maybe a map or something oh, that looks kind of cool. Was there anything that stuck out to you in that search?
Well, I'll name one in a sort of problematic country from political perspective, and then I'll name one in a less problematic country.
Okay.
So one that stands out to me as really sort of oddball wild are the two monorail extensions that are being built in Cairo.
Okay.
So Cairo has a metro, okay, and it's extremely well used. It is an extremely dense and very large city. I'm not sure if folks realize how big Cairo is. And the government has decided to build a new capital, which is to the east of Cairo, but it's still sort of within the metropolitan area. And so they're building a monorail line that's going out from Cairo essentially to that new administrative capital. And when you look at the satellite views of this area, I mean, it's just wild. These gigantic new parts of the city that are being built at pretty high densities with these enormous boulevards and monorail running through it. It's just kind of wild to see and almost incomprehensible from an American perspective. I mean, can you imagine an enormous new capital city being built in the US today? Absolutely not.
No.
I mean, it's not within the realm of, and perhaps it shouldn't be. I mean, it's kind of crazy. So that's one crazy project.
Okay.
And then a project in Sydney. Sydney has a series of new automated metro lines that are underway that are sort of supplementing its regional rail system. Australia has this really interesting regional rail network that exists in a number of cities in Brisbane, Melbourne, Sydney, Perth, that has been what they've relied on since British colonialism, in the 1800s, I guess. But they are supplementing these with automated metro lines that are serving a number of the communities around Sydney Center. And some of that is going to open this coming year. So I'm excited to see how that's implemented.
I also want to ask you about this emerging project agreement that is something that the Build America Bureau has put together, I guess, for getting funding for multiple different projects in multiple different topic areas, if I can call them that, like energy and transportation and all those policies. We're coming up with all these different ways to use our funding. We're coming up with better ways to coordinate. I'm wondering if you'd seen this before, and also if there's other things on your mind that you thought, from a federal funding perspective are interesting.
So my sense from talking with folks at the local level is that they almost feel barraged with the sheer number of different federal programs that they're having to deal with. It's not so obvious that, you have a project you want to do and you're supposed to apply for some specific grant. So the idea of the federal government being able to come to cities and say, hey, we recognize that you have a number of different ideas for how you want to change your community, and you should apply. We're going to help you apply for a number of different grants simultaneously. Seems like a wonderful one. I mean, that's in theory going to solve some bureaucratic nightmares that cities currently have to go through. And, if it were extended to cities with lower levels of capacity, I think it could be particularly interesting because it would help communities that just don't know how to apply successfully to do so. I'm particularly interested in whether we could extend this line of thinking beyond just transportation, but into housing. And the federal government has recently announced that it's changed its rules related to these large transportation loan programs that are called TIFIA and RIF. And in theory, what's going to be made possible is that you'll be able to get a loan for a affordable housing project located near transit at a significantly reduced cost compared to current loan costs. And I think that could be wonderful if combined with, for example, a federal investment in a new transit project. What if the federal government were to say, we will provide you not only funding for that transit line, but we'll provide you low-cost loans to ensure that there's affordable housing and new housing in general located near the stations on that new line. I think that could be the ideal combination.
And what about the scoring system for some of these larger projects too? I mean, I feel like I saw something that said they wanted to change the scoring systems that said you had to have better zoning around your transit lines in order to get some of this funding because it's getting so competitive. They're going to have to start, figuring out ways to parse it out even more.
I certainly think there has been discussion of that. I'm not sure it will be realized, but one thing I think is worth emphasizing here is that, in order to get funding for a transit project right now, you as a transit agency have to demonstrate your financial stability, right? You essentially have to be able to say, I will be able to maintain this transit project over the 30 years that are coming after the transit project is built. I have the financial resources to be able to do so as a transit agency. Now, the reality is that transit agencies often run into financial issues, as we're seeing with the fiscal cliff. But in general, that serves as a sort of minimum requirement for any project that gets funding from the federal government. The question that I have is, why doesn't the federal government have a similar minimum requirement for land use policy or housing production near transit? In my view, this shouldn't be a scoring matter. This should be a minimum that's required for any new project.
Yeah. That minimum thing makes me think of, and going back to the Cairo thing, here in California, they're trying to build a city. The billionaires are trying to build a city between Sacramento and the Bay Area. And they released like this manifesto thing last week where they said, we want minimums of basically 20 units an acre on the land that we're building on. And, from a TOD perspective, when we talked about, the most efficient densities for transit, I think the 15 to 20 was kind of like the minimum. I mean, 7 was Pushkar and Zupan's number for providing commuter rail service or whatever, but that's such a small number. It doesn't really move the needle. But I feel like this 15 to 20 is even too low. And so thinking about putting minimums on things like that, how much affordable housing you have, how much zoning capacity you have, et cetera, would be a really great way to go forward. I like it. That's my basic way of saying it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you. And actually, I agree with you that number is too low. I mean, there's an article I just read, a paper by Robert Severo and Eric Guerra from 2011, where they try to quantify what the minimum densities are needed to support quality transit. Yep. And what they said was you needed at least 30 per acre and preferably 45 to support a good transit system. Yeah. So, if we're going at 20, I think it's better than most suburban sprawl, undoubtedly, but it's not high enough for good transit.
It's still kind of sprawly to me. It's a lot, but it's probably not enough, especially if you want to make big investments. Thanks for joining us. Stay tuned for part 2 with Yonah and my scoring of last year's predictions and next year's big ideas. And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this week's podcast, and you can find out more at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And sign up for our 17-year-old newsletter by visiting theoverheadwire.com. To get the show each week, follow along at your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, YouTube, TuneIn, Apple Podcasts, and many, many more. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.